Hello and welcome to Living a Culture of Life podcast by Human Life International. I'm your host, Colleen, and I'm joined today by Father Boquet, our president. Welcome, Father.
Well, Colleen, it's great to be back with you once again. It's been some time.
I was going to say, yeah, it's been a while since we've had you in the studio. And we have such an interesting topic today, talking about surrogacy, which, I don't know, I've heard a lot more about it in the past 6 months or so. It's really just become a topic that seems to be in the news a lot more, and something that I've been made aware of as more of a problem. So I'm really excited to kind of dive into this because you and I have never talked about it. I think you did with Tad before I took over hosting the podcast like over a year ago. But we've never sat down to have a podcast on this. So
sure, it's a very appropriate subject today, especially being talked about in many different media outlets.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because at one point over Christmas, I was listening to a radio station, I was listening to a radio station on an app. Because I was at my house and I didn't want to turn on the radio and I had my phone. So it was pulling it up. It was Christmas music, pop station. And I pulled it up and it said that the online player was sponsored by the state surrogacy network. And I was like, well, I'm not going to listen to this. But also I was shocked. I had no clue that there was a state surrogacy network or that it was just that common that a mainstream pop radio station was going to have a sponsor of a surrogacy network. Right. So that was really the point where I kind of took a step back and I was like, we need to talk about this on the podcast because this is clearly a problem that's way more pervasive than I realized. So yeah, this will be a good subject to dive into. But before we get started on that, Father, you've been gone for mission travel and all of that. Can you just share a little bit with our audience of what's going on in the mission field?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times, we hear so much news what's happening in the U.S. and the pro-life and family movement, which is great to hear and exciting. But, this is an opportunity also for you and I to talk about what's going on in our mission field, what's happening around the world. So I appreciate the fact that you're given an opportunity today before we leap right into a topic, if you will. Because
I wanted to hear about it because you've been gone. So it's always good to hear a little bit about what's going on.
The whole beauty of the mission really is that HLI it's a global mission. And I think that's the important thing for our listeners to see, that we have people across the planet every day who are engaged in this great conversation. So for myself, of most recent, we had our international gathering in the Philippines in Cebu. And this was our, we call our Asian Pacific Congress on Family, Faith, and Faith, Life, and Family. ASPAC, yes. And
that's how I know it.
That's usually what I use. So sometimes I got to think it through, spell it all out. But it was 22 countries or a little bit more than that participated, almost 600 delegates.
All from the Caribbean?
This is all from Asia.
That's what I meant.
Yeah. And so all from across the Asian countries, which was remarkable because it had been delayed for 3 years because of the COVID situation. And people then still leery of travel. So it was such an excitement. But the topic was really on the issues of faith. As a people of God, how do we respond in faith to the situations that are happening around the world, particularly affecting family and life? And it was great to hear all these wonderful stories from people from our own affiliates around Asia, but also delegates representing different groups gathering together and hearing those stories, whether it be through adoption agencies like we have in Hungary, to hear people speak about this, or what we see happening with Dr. Finto in India and in the Kerala community and Bangalore community, and you are realizing how we're fighting against the mindset of a one-child, two-child policy that we see being pushed by governments around the world. And then we had the other side where you're seeing the pregnancy care centers give witness, to what they're doing. And that came from across different communities. We even had religious sisters that we work with in the Philippines that we help support speak about this. We had Sisters of Charity from other parts of Asia come. So it really was a great, wonderful picture of the pro-life movement.
Yeah, and I saw that Amanda Ackman, who we had on the podcast a couple times now, she was there. And I thought that was really cool that she traveled all the way from Canada to be able to be present at that event as well.
She was one of our main speakers. So she was able to talk about what's not really happening that much currently in the Asia community, euthanasia. Okay. But it's beginning to grow. The swell is growing, especially with aging populations that we see in Japan and we see in other parts of Asia.
Where you have this high number of people who are older who didn't have children and a very small number of young people to support them. From a financial perspective, governments are looking at it saying, euthanasia is the way to deal with this, so we don't have to care for the elderly.
That Amanda approached it, which I think is always important, is not only to talk about the bioethical issue, the dilemma, the moral problem, but what are we doing to resolve it? And that's what Amanda took the approach of, is that what she has been doing in Canada and what she's been doing in other countries, trying to bring a conversation of how do we serve life? How do we witness to the beauty of life? especially with those with terminal illnesses, dealing with age-related illnesses, are just the simple process of growing older. That so many of these, our brothers and sisters, get relegated to the sidelines and ignored by the general population, and sadly, even from family members.
And our listeners might actually remember that because we did have her on the podcast discussing her work in Canada and everything she's doing there. And that was just such an excellent episode to hear about fostering like this beauty and this love of life at the end of life.
Exactly. And she has such an energy, which is contagious, which is very exciting. And again, that's a witness to life too, because sometimes, the presenters, and myself included, can get so caught up in the conversation and the topic that we fail to kind of express a sense of joy as we deal with these, as we confront these situations. But Amanda is just bubbly and contagious. And to see some of the sisters do the same thing. But also I was in Africa recently, which those who have been following the podcast and following HLI's news and my Spirit and Life articles and our various ways of communication, we have a real situation right now with the EU and the Asian, Caribbean, and Pacific community.
Caribbean, Pacific.
Right. Yeah. So you're looking at, this whole movement of the AUCACP. And so you look at this and you say, okay, what's happening here? So this is now an intrusion from the EU, from the UN, and other non-governmental organizations trying to push, i.e., contraception, abortion, sterilization, the whole transgender issue today, and impose these so-called values upon nations that do not welcome this environment. And so recently, in Kigali, Rwanda, I encountered some of this even before all this was now making the headlines. And you're seeing the push of the government, from other countries coming into nations where life and family are so important and so cherished. And now you're seeing ideologies that are completely opposed to those values. So this is something that I'm seeing in my mission travels, and the conversations are growing.
Okay, so I have a question that's going to be my nice smooth segue into our topic of conversation. Is IVF a bigger problem in these countries? Because I remember seeing stories from, I think it was Nigeria, where nurses were saying that they didn't realize that IVF was a problem. And I didn't realize that IVF was a thing. I think of it as like a very much of a rich, like first world country. We're very rich and we're going to use IVF to have children because we don't want to, for X, Y, or Z reason. I don't think of it as hey, we're a developing nation and we have IVF problems. So is that a problem in third world countries? And that's a nice little segue into surrogacy, because often surrogacy and IVF are linked.
It's a good way, and it's a good way of looking at it, because in my experience now in these 13 years, that when you look at the issue of surrogacy, in vitro fertilization, IVF, or you look at artificial insemination, you look at all the various techniques that are being used today in the service of life, possibly, because there are moral means to serve life, in situations that where a couple might struggling with infertility. We've had that conversation in this podcast before. Yeah. And then you have the other side of the coin, where you have the exploitation of women through surrogacy, and you see the exploitation of children through IVF. So yes, Colleen, it is growing. Now, what you did say is very important. In much of the developing world where finances are not as available, yes, many of these means are available to those that have the means. They're wealthy. And so you see this in many of the metropolitans. You see it more linked to the cities. You get into the rural communities, you don't see this very much at all. At least I have not seen it. But what I have noticed, though, is that it is moving more quickly than people are suspecting. If I may, without giving too much detail, because I just had this conversation regarding the church in Uganda.
Okay.
Now, there, which you'll see in Uganda, because it has a large young population and children are still very much welcomed by families, and per ratio of children to a woman is higher than many other African nations. So what you'll see in Uganda is all of the anti-life agencies strongly working to convince Ugandan women and men not to have children, or to limit the number of children. So there, what you'll see is IVF finding ways of inroad. And the reason why I bring it up is that just this week, I had a conversation because on the subject, because the bishops there are realizing this is growing. And as we know, because so many of these developing nations, particularly in Africa, have not been dealing with this. So even the formation in the seminary would not necessarily have dealt specifically with IVF or artificial insemination.
Because it just hasn't been an issue.
It's just not an issue. Same thing with abortion, because we know abortion's wrong. So you're not going to have a problem with them teaching against it. But what they don't know is all the other aspects.
Teaching in favor of
right.
abortion. Yeah.
Well, teaching against abortion itself, in the sense that they're fighting against this crime against human life.
Yeah.
So, but the idea is that it's not legal there. So in many of their minds, yes, I know it's wrong. No, we're not going to ever endorse this. But our people are not dealing with it. But it's finding its inroad. So now IVF is finding its inroad, and other things are finding inroads. So what I noticed is the conversation is about education. It's about formation. It's about teaching people, what are these issues and why should we be concerned? The issue of surrogacy, in vitro fertilization, artificial insemination. You also have, sadly, religious, priest, lay faithful. Say, well, aren't we in favor of children? Why would we be opposed to the use of these techniques?
Yeah, because we talked about this with IVF and contraception, and we talked about them both in the podcast. If one looks like it's anti-child and the other one looks like it's pro-child,
right?
So why do we have problems with both?
Correct. That's correct. And so I think what we're seeing in the developing world, and what I noticed while in Cebu in the Philippines, was this conversation was much more, in a sense, present than it had been in previous years, because many of the countries now are seeing this rise, and we have to also keep asking ourselves why is this rising? Why is this happening? So those were questions that were being posed at the Congress.
Do you ever see situations in like developing nations where people from like America or Europe are having women in third world countries be surrogates for them so that they can have a child, or does it usually happen within the country itself?
No, you'll see, like we had in Ukraine. Let's go back to the situation currently in Ukraine with the war.
Can you explain that a little bit?
Because so if we go back,
I wasn't. That was Tad. That wasn't me.
Sure. So if we go back in time, many of our audience may or may not be aware as well, and that is, when the war began, there was this outcry because there were women who were hired in a contract agreement through surrogacy to carry a child for wealthy people or families in other countries, Western countries mostly. And because of the war, there was not an ability to either have the women come out of the country or to be able to have the child that had already been born be able to be transferred. So all of a sudden now you had this outcry because of the situation that these women were facing, the children were facing, and then those that entered into a contract agreement could not fulfill the contract. So the money could not be exchanged, the children could not be transferred, the legal parts could not be handled. And so this was an example that really got into the media. It picked up. Now, the social media, of course, picked it up from the whole progressive mindset that this is a good thing. It's a sad situation of what's happening in Ukraine, but we should recognize that how do we help these women? How do we get these children where they're going? In other words, they kind of were affirming surrogacy as something that was legit. So they
were affirming surrogacy as a good thing, and then saying, how can we help women fulfill their contract agreements? Basically,
right. Basically. But in other words, we're using the situation in Ukraine to talk about surrogacy.
And so to bring it into the public conversation, to normalize it.
Right. They were talking about the difficult moment. Yes, and it was. I mean, obviously, these women are in a difficult situation. The children are in a difficult situation. But
war aside, it would still be a difficult situation.
Exactly. But they were using the moment, and it brought surrogacy into the mainline conversation. And so people were asking, well, what is this? What are you talking about? And so it helped people who were concerned about this to become more aware, and people who were unaware to become aware of something. So that's just an example.
So can you explain now for our listeners, because you were saying before we started the podcast that there's like different types of surrogacy, basically. Can you explain those for our listeners just so they kind of understand what's going on here? And I'd also be curious to know, if you know offhand, like historically, what was surrogacy? Was surrogacy really a thing before modern science took over? Or I don't know, I'm thinking back to like the Bible where women would hand their maids and like have a child through them. Like, would that be considered surrogacy?
Well, not really, because what's happening is that obviously the husband in that situation you're speaking about is
Abraham
is
and
cooperating,
Jacob
freely, and the woman is cooperating freely in an act, with each other. So, but what we're talking about here is something very, very different.
Okay.
And so we don't have time to really go through the biblical understanding of that. And so
it just occurred to me that it's the same kind of idea that, I can't have a child, so let my husband have a child with another woman.
Right. Well, I mean, the mentality would be there, but that again, that takes a little more time to talk through it. But I think that what we have to look at here is the intent and the act and the whole means by which it's obtained.
Okay.
So in the current understanding of surrogacy, which you asked a question of, until you had these particular techniques that became more readily available, like with artificial insemination. So let's just kind of look at that. So when we look at surrogacy in this understanding, you have a woman who is willing to be, whose own ovum is used. So her ovum is not removed, right? So her own ovum is used, and semen is inseminated. So she's inseminated with the semen. It could be, a donor that she doesn't even know at all. In some cases, it might be someone who's entered into a contract with her in a situation where you have a wife that may be infertile and the husband's sperm is used, and she becomes inseminated with his sperm and carries his child and her child. Not the donor ovum.
So the wife of the husband doesn't have anything to do with this.
Nothing
it's
to
the
do with
husband with some other woman having a child for the husband and wife to
And so the
take care
contract is basically the moment the child is born, the mother of this child, the biological mother of this child, who's been inseminated with the husband's sperm, now will render the child over to them, and that's how that transaction occurs. And I'm using terms very clearly here because it is a transaction. It's a legal transaction. It's some contract is made here. So you can see how there's a commodification process here of the woman who freely accepts this. She knows what she's doing and in this situation. So that would be where you're dealing with use of artificial insemination.
Okay.
So then you have the process through in vitro fertilization. So this is what many people would be more familiar with. And that is, so the ovum, in some cases, it could be the wife and the husband, because of some reason that she's unable to conceive within her womb. So they remove the ovum and use the sperm donated by the husband. And then conception occurs in a petri dish, all right, in vitro, in glass. And then the newly conceived life is placed into the womb. In the
surrogate woman's.
Well, yeah. So
in this case, like what we're talking about.
Exactly.
Yes.
So again, you're still dealing with a donor womb in this situation. So, but you're dealing with the ovum from the wife and the husband, and the surrogate has no relationship to this child whatsoever, no genetic relationship. Basically, you've hired a womb to carry your child.
Because for some reason you can't.
Right.
Interesting.
So another case could be, as we explained earlier, you might have a donor ovum and then donor sperm.
Yes.
So two people that don't even know each other at all, no husband and wife at all, but basically you're dealing with two people that in the same surrogate situation. So it's not her own ovum that's used, but two the ovum and an sperm from outside are being used. Or in the first situation, you might have where it's the surrogate woman's own ovum. For some reason, whatever that reason may be, that could be also removed and then combined either with donor sperm or with, a person that she knows or doesn't know. So there's so many ways of looking at it.
It kind of boils down to either it's the surrogate mother's ovum and sperm from someone else, or it's random sperm, random ovum, surrogate mother carries child with no biological relation to her.
Which is
I wonder scientifically what that does. Like, I feel like that would be like just knowing how intimate that bonding is if you're injected with like a child who you have no genetic like connection to. I'd be really curious to dive in someday to like the actual science of what that does.
Well, there are many stories, Colleen, about the situation because, especially, for the biological relationship that you just mentioned. So let's say that you have where it's the surrogate mother, right? Whether it is by biological connection to the child or, again, just a donor womb. I hate to say it in that way. It sounds so horrible, but and it is. But now bonds with this child. This child she's carried for 9 months. This child she's nurtured. She's loved. She's done everything she's needed to do to care for herself, to care for the child, and doesn't want to give the child up. And so you have so many situations here. So when you're looking at a contract, you can imagine all the legal problems that happen. You can imagine, going into a courtroom and now they're arguing over who has a right to this child. And so, and then no one speaks about the child's rights, and as we know, as we've spoken many times before, the child has rights to be conceived, in conjugal love,
Mm-hmm.
be welcomed by their biological parents, to be nurtured in the womb of their own biological mother,
Yeah.
and to be born and placed in the arms of their own mother.
I just feel like the more we learn about the actual development of a child, especially like the development of a child before they're born, like just scientifically and everything that goes on, it just refutes everything that we do.
Right.
Not we do, that the world is doing with surrogacy and all of that. Like the more you learn about how the child needs to develop and all of the bonding that happens, the more clear it is that God created us like scientifically and spiritually to develop within the womb of our own biological mother, within the marriage of our biological parents.
And also, it denies the unity and the beautiful fruitfulness of marital love.
Yeah.
Which is where a child is to be welcomed and to be begotten.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why our church teaches such beautiful language, which I just used, to be begotten, not made. So here, we have a language that so speaks of the sanctity of the marital act, that speaks of the sanctity of human life. And so, and what happens is we've seen, this great industry grow because of exploitation of women. And obviously, it starts off, as so many things do, by looking at situations where you might be dealing with a couple who has an unwanted infertility. They're not, something has happened that they're not able to conceive,
which is a huge cross.
It's a huge cross. And so there is a way, as I mentioned earlier, there are moral means upon which we can serve the conjugal act, serve conjugal love, not replace it. So as we've been talking about, the two that I mentioned, artificial insemination, replaces. So it substitutes. In vitro fertilization substitutes for the husband and wife, and substitutes for the conjugal act. So this is where it's important for our listeners to avail themselves to the church's teaching, which I know you'll put in the show notes and so forth, that people need to really understand what the church teaches that we can't do in 45 minutes to an hour.
Well, and I think it is really important whenever you're having conversations on these subjects to acknowledge and recognize that couples suffering with infertility have a huge cross to bear, and just like acknowledge that, and acknowledge that some people do turn to surrogacy because of a cross that is unnatural in a sense. Like it's because of sin. Like pain and sin came into the world because of original sin, basically. And just when people are speaking against surrogacy, it's not trying to invalidate the cross of infertility. It's just saying that this particular way of creating a child and having a child is denying the rights of the child and the rights of the couple within marriage.
That's right. And so I think what's important is for couples that may be listening, or maybe we know people. I know couples that struggle with the cross of infertility. I have very dear friends, and they when they reached out for guidance and support, this is where we're able to guide them, and bring them to means that upholds the dignity of the sanctity of marriage, upholds the dignity of conjugal love, and at the same time works with them to assist them, and to achieve this wonderful desire that they want to see fulfilled. But at the same time, we always sometimes are afraid to talk about, and that's a different subject for us to talk about another time. We have talked about the cross of infertility in our podcast, and that is, after exhausting those means, there, as Pope Benedict would often say, that we have to be there to when the answer is there's nothing more than can be done, and that what all that has been done that has been morally permissible, and we still not have achieved the desired end through those means. That's the cross of infertility, and so we have to be there to support, to love, to care. And this is where, again, so many couples have been fortunate to be able to turn toward the beautiful gift of adoption and open themselves up to welcoming a child in a very different way.
So this just opened the door to my next question. How is surrogacy different than adoption? Because on the surface, you could look at it as couple wants to have a child, they're not able to conceive for some reason, and they're going to pay money and get a child. And I know adoption is very different than that. That's a very cold way of putting it. And I don't mean that that's necessarily what I think it is. I'm just saying that if I was someone who didn't know anything about church teachings and I was looking at it on the surface, to me, they might look the same. So can you explain why they're different? So
let's look at, you actually kind of highlighted some various ways of approaching this. You look at the two different acts that are involved. So when you look at the issue of surrogacy, there's an intent and there's an action that occurs in order to achieve that end. And so in surrogacy, you're already dealing with immoral means. So we have an exploitation that is occurring, not only of the woman herself, but also the procreative means by which life is to be welcomed, is being denied in such this situation. And because, whether we're talking about artificial insemination, even if it's her own ovum that is being used, it is still not by conjugal love. It is still not by a marital act. It is not it could be even her own, the situation here is, again, we're using a means to achieve an end. And so the child is not begotten. The child is, in a sense, an act has been employed to substitute for an act that should in itself always be open to the gift of life. So now adoption is a different kind of act, because here it's the fact that you have a child that is begotten of parents, in some situations difficult, as we've done many times here in talking about the issue of pregnancy care centers and situations that may be dealing with violence. It might be dealing with a consenting act, but not able to raise the child. You might have a situation of poverty that we've seen in other countries where they would love to raise their child, but the means by which they need are not available to them. We just wrote a story recently on an issue in Hungary.
Yeah.
So there are many stories like this, but adoption is that the child is being given a chance to be raised in a family that will welcome and love and care that the parents could not provide for whatever means. So it wasn't done through some type of artificial insemination. It wasn't done by some type of in vitro fertilization. It was done, as we have known, in a natural act, whether between parents or people who love each other or in other situations.
So basically, with surrogacy, you have a couple wants a child, they pay money, so that child is created and they're given a child.
Right.
Versus with adoption, a couple wants a child and they're going to take a child who may not be able to grow up with a loving home for some reason, and they're going to take them, invite them into their home and welcome them.
And even though there may be some contractual relationship, they're different kinds of acts. So because what people look at today is, well, to adopt a child can be very expensive. There's lots of legal fees and things. But at one time, this was not the case. We all know, if we're old enough to remember, especially in the Catholic Church, we had beautiful Catholic charities that used to do this very, very beautifully, and many orphanages run by the Catholic Church, where children that were, for whatever means, the parents could not raise them, and the sisters, the brothers, the various institutes within the church would raise these children and find good homes for them. There might have been some legal fees or legal things attached to that, but they were very minimum, to be able to foster adoption. And I know adults today that were adopted that way, and are so grateful that their parents had the courage, at the time to give them for adoption when they could not raise them themselves.
So those fees are basically an imposition of the government having to put legal things there. They're not it's different than a couple paying money to get a child.
Different
as a
kind
commodity.
of contract, different kind of act. Now, I would say this, and I'll put this first to here. I am a strong advocate for changing the way that we do this, because I think it's absurd from what I hear from adopting parents of how much money is having to be spent in order to adopt a child. And I think that's something that has to be addressed.
To take a child who may not have a home and give them a home,
absolutely,
a loving home.
Absolutely.
The child, in a sense, deserves that. They deserve to grow up with loving parents, even if for some reason it's not able to be their own biological parents.
And in this situation, again, we're dealing with two different acts from the very beginning. And, so adoption is not entering into a moral means, whereas the first is an immoral act. And because the whole act itself, is opposed to the dignity of human life. Adoption is an act of charity, an act of kindness, an act of love, an openness, a sacrificial gift that is being made on behalf of the adopting parents. And I would say in some cases, where the actual biological parent or parents, just for whatever reason, are not able to raise their child, lovingly give their child an opportunity that the child may not have had.
Well, we had a story about that from Hungary, where in Hungary, legally, children are not allowed to be raised in a home where it's impoverished, because the government wants the children to grow up, obviously, with their needs provided for, so they'll take them away from the biological parents. And that's a whole different conversation about whether or not that should be going on, because obviously children should be fed, but you also shouldn't be taking children away from their biological parents. But
that's right. Children have rights. Children have rights. That's a different
that's a whole
podcast.
Different story. But in that situation, we had a story where this woman and her husband, they already had 3 children and they were very poor and they were afraid the government was basically going to take away their 4th child and put them in the foster care system. So because of HLI Hungary's adoption program, they were able to find loving parents
Correct.
to adopt that child.
Correct. Yeah, I think it's just important to see the 2 different acts, the 2 different, means by which are used to obtain the end, and also, the whole with the intent itself. And so I think it's important as we look at those. And so today, for example, you have another industry that gets around this, and so you have same-sex couples.
Yeah, that was actually going to be a question. Do you know the answer to this? Do most couples get surrogacy because they struggle with infertility and they want to have a child, or is surrogacy more used for homosexual couples who want a child, or for, I think in your column you were using the example of women who are having surrogates so that their body isn't harmed by having a child,
Correct.
quote unquote harmed, not.
That's correct.
They don't want their figure to change by having a child.
Right.
Do you know which is more common?
Not off the top of my head in this moment, but I mean, I've been reading different studies, showing different, percentages and numbers. But we are seeing a rise in what you just brought up in the latter, and that is where women from wealthy environments, wealthy cultures, are wanting to keep their careers, going, or wanting to maintain some type of, bodily look, and not willing to go through the quote unquote the process, of being pregnant and all the various things that go along with the biological changes, and so they're employing surrogacy, as a means. We're also seeing single women, who don't want to be married but want to be a parent. And so they're now employing through means of through surrogacy, IVF, to be able to have a child. And that's why.
Would that be IVF or artificial insemination?
In some cases, it's through surrogacy.
Interesting.
Yeah. So because again, they're just looking, to welcome a child. I'm changing some of my words very carefully because I don't like using the word have. And the reason for that is that a child is not a thing. It's not like having a cup of coffee or having. So, even though it's not a bad word, I try very much to use the language of the church because it is about welcoming. And when we talk about what we're doing, it's not necessarily welcoming a child. The intent there really is having. It's really, creating an environment where we can create this child. So either I'm not inconvenienced, or because of the situation that we're dealing with, maybe it is a cross of infertility. The means, justify the end here, and that's it, which is never the case. And so it's important for us to really keep the language that the child is a gift, always a gift, and no one has a right to a child. And so a child is never to be treated as a commodity that can be exchanged in some kind of contract, some kind of legal agreement, or some exchange of money or of some benefit. A child is not a thing.
And as we already covered, adoption doesn't fit in that category.
Exactly.
Which was why one reason I wanted to bring it up.
Completely not in that category.
Completely on the surface, it could look like that. And so that's one reason I did want to kind of tackle that question, because it needs to be very clear for people that adoption is different than all these other means that we're talking about, which make a child a commodity.
And I would say to anyone listening, if you have an openness to adopting, please adopt. We need to talk more about this because there's so many beautiful children out there that would be so blessed to be welcomed into a family and to give an opportunity to have a family. And so,
have you ever seen the movie Room for One More?
Yes.
I love that movie with Cary Grant, and I forget who the woman is who plays the mother, but basically then they're not adopting. Basically she visits the home at the beginning of the movie, and the woman's like, well, the babies here are we have people waiting 5 years to adopt a child, but all the 12-year-olds, the teenagers, the ones, kids who they're older, and she was like the woman running the adoption agency in the movie from I think it's the 50s, basically says nobody wants to adopt the older kids. And so Cary Grant's wife, whose name I can't remember in this, she starts welcoming the children in. And the first girl suffered mental problems. The second one had either cerebral palsy or polio, or for some reason had leg braces on. And it's just the most beautiful movie. If they already have 3 children, and she's like, stray dog, we're going to welcome into the house. Child who needs crutches or has leg braces, we're going to welcome him too. And it's basically the cat's going to have kittens, they're going to welcome. And I think there's a rabbit too. Basically this mother just has this openness to all life and is taking in anyone who needs a home. And it's just it was such an inspirational movie. So beautiful.
So we're talking about really it's a culture of life.
Yeah.
It's really opening oneself up to the beauty of life and serving life. And today there are young adolescents, and young teenagers that have not been able to be adopted. And so I would just say that, to our listeners, and that may be out there who have the means. And I know families where the husband and wife, I know a situation where both husband and wife were adopted. And so they have welcomed children, into their life, and they've opened themselves up to adopting children. And I think we need to talk more about the gift of adoption. We need to talk more about the beauty of serving life and in opening ourselves. I mean, this is many, many decades ago, and I remember that even some religious sisters and a priest at one time when where actually I know a young man that was adopted by a priest because his family was not able to care for him, and no one
do that in the church.
Not anymore. But at one time you were, and this young man today speaks of such gratitude. Because of the priest was willing to, and the bishop gave permission. Everyone was involved, and and the faith community came together and helped father, because there was many things he could not do, but the community came together. Today that would not be permissible, but the idea is just to create that kind of environment. And so as we deal with the immorality of surrogacy, in vitro fertilization, and all these various scientific techniques today that are being used to exploit the situation and the vulnerability of people. And as we know, as I wrote in my column, and I know we've written on many times on our website, that when you look in the developing world, particularly where we see surrogacy, being employed, most of the time it's women of need. There's vulnerability. They're being exploited. They're being used.
You're just anticipating all my questions, because my next question was going to be, how does surrogacy exploit impoverished women?
Right.
So,
and I've seen with my own eyes this reality, and so
where have you seen it?
Well, mostly in India. I've seen it in parts of Africa. I've seen it in other countries in Asia.
So you just met women who were impoverished who agreed to be surrogates because they needed the financial
I meet
means.
them at conferences, congresses. I'm brought into, and sometimes in the mission field itself. And I remember being in a very, very impoverished neighborhood, and some religious sisters introducing me to a couple of women who were pregnant, and now they're caring for. And because of a contract that was entered into, and the contract was breached,
So sad.
on the other side, the people decided we don't want the child, and for various reasons, And I think it's important to see that, these are vulnerable women being used. Their financial means are very difficult. Their economic situation, in the sense of living arrangements, are very bad. And someone comes in and offers to them a means to have a nicer place to live, other means available to them that they would never have. It's an opportunity that they may never have. They get exploited. It's exploitation.
Well, and I think you see that too with IVF, because they target college girls being like, you should donate your eggs and we're going to pay you a lot of money. And the college girls are like, $4,000 sounds great. Of course I will. And so the same thing of these industries target people who are vulnerable and offer a lot of money to be able to exploit them.
Right. But you also get to the point, like there's numbers of examples where the contract is nullified. Reason for that, like in one of our columns, we mentioned where a same-sex couple finds out, that the child, the mother carrying the child, has been diagnosed with breast cancer.
Because that was all over the news. I think her name was Brittany Pearson, I think.
Yes.
I saw a bunch of news articles about it when it was happening.
Decided, no, we don't want the child. And
they forced her to abort.
That's right.
Or they were trying to force her to have an abortion.
Right.
But it makes sense once you kind of violate the right of the child and you tamper with God's plan for how children are supposed to be conceived. Right. It makes sense that those abuses are going to go further and further.
Well, if it's a contract. So what happens if, and it's horrible to use it as an example, but I will, and that is you go into a car dealership and you buy a new car. And within 30 days, the car breaks down. You're having all these problems. Well, there's an agreement that's been made or a contract that's been signed. You want to build a house. You enter into a contract with the carpenter and all the various components. When something doesn't happen right, there's been a breach of contract. And you can hold a certain percentage back. You can nullify the contract. You can do. This is how we're treating human life. This is how we're treating women. This is how we're treating children. And this is how we are undermining the dignity of marriage. And we're undermining really society itself, where we are treating, we've ruptured, we've divorced, the marital act from procreation. And we're using science, we're using techniques that, to achieve our ends.
We've also lost the understanding of covenant and marriage, and a covenant is different than a contract. And yeah, it's so you're losing the spiritual aspect, I guess, basically is what I'm trying to say. Is a contract is very much black and white material. There's no spiritual, there's nothing spiritually going on there. It's just,
what's interesting,
I'm going to give you money and you're going to give me the object I want.
Right, exactly. And that's how it's approached. And so when you think of what Pope Francis has been saying about the subject, we can go back to Pope Benedict, Pope John Paul II. So this is not, as when we first started, is this something new? Is something I'm just hearing about? No, this has been going on now for decades. And so it's
just been ramped up because of science.
Exactly. And because of the global market. So, let's be honest. Even with adoption, let's kind of go back to that for a second. We can see, again, how a child could be commodified, right? So if you are in a country, and I'm not getting into countries because the stories are out there, people can look them up. But at one time, you were able to adopt children from certain Asian countries. And you were able to, because the means to do it in the States was so expensive, but you can enter into a contract to adopt a child from abroad. And so what happened when the government, it all became more publicly known? Well, why are you allowing your children to be adopted so easily? Why are you doing this? It all of a sudden exposed a situation. Now, the parents on this end were well intended. They were wanting to welcome a child, and for whatever means could not have a child themselves, welcome a child themselves. So they reached out to another means. So again, I don't want to paint them in the same situation that we talk about surrogacy and IVF. I'm not doing that. But I'm just saying is that if a child becomes who pays the highest money, who gives me the better options, who is going to give me the better health care, who is going to, so you can almost see again, there's where these other little encroachments can happen and the child becomes a commodity. Highest bidder wins. This is always bad. Always something evil that should never be done. And so we got to be very careful as we deal with human life and the dignity of life, never to allow ourselves to get into any area of commodification, whether it be through immoral means or whether it be through something that on the outside is a very good thing, adoption, but it can be manipulated in such a way where it can turn into an industry that commodifies a child. And we don't want any of this at all.
What did Pope Francis say about surrogacy? Because I know that he made some comments about it this year. And what exactly was he saying about it?
Just the same thing you and I are talking about. He looked at it from an exploitation. He really clearly just said, this is an exploitation of women. It's taken advantage of women's vulnerability in many of the developing countries, and it's turning the what should be the fruit of conjugal love into something that it's not meant to be. And again, it commodifies the child. Now, the progressive media and the progressive left, obviously, we're not very happy with what the Holy Father said. The same way that my article this past week, speaking about children, welcoming children, his comments particularly of Italy, did not get well received by the progressive left. And why? Because it doesn't go with the narrative. So what the Holy Father is saying in both regards, whether we're talking about the issue of surrogacy or whether we're talking about the unwelcoming of children, that the Holy Father is touching very important nerves. And he's raising the conversation, making people look at, why is this wrong? What are we dealing with here? And who are we dealing with here? That's a better question.
It's interesting because I definitely have heard some Catholics who had problems with what he said about surrogacy, not problems with what he was saying about surrogacy, but saying that he should have acknowledged the cross of couples who had infertility and been a little bit more compassionate about that. But I actually think that he was addressing ambassadors. So I don't think that his intended audience was couples struggling with infertility. It was ambassadors who, I think he was saying, you should politically do something about this.
And you should take it in the whole. He has spoken about the issue of the cross of infertility.
Oh, he has?
He has spoken on this on other occasions. But you're right. It also depends what environment he's in and and who is he addressing in this specific moment.
And that was my point. That's kind of why I wanted to bring it up, is that he wasn't when he made these comments, he wasn't trying to negate the cross of infertility. He
No.
was speaking to political people, representatives, and saying politically, this is exploiting people. There should be a ban on
And
it.
he's also reaffirmed what John Paul himself said, and what we have said in many of the church's documents. How is science seeking moral means of assisting couples who struggle with infertility? And so that is a thing that we should always be also speaking about. What are those moral means? And to be honest, so many couples who are struggling with the cross of infertility, this is never spoken to them. So all they hear is IVF from their doctors, and
I think it's similar because it's approached the same way, I think, in general from doctors, that women struggling with like hormonal imbalances and infertility, that way it's like, oh, you're struggling with this, here, have birth control. Like, oh, you have heavy periods, here, have birth control. Oh, you have acne, here, have birth control. And they're never taught about how to heal that, what they can do morally. I mean, yeah, like the root cause is never addressed. It's like, let's slap a Band-Aid on. And I think doctors also in general can try to treat infertility that way too, where they're not saying, here's things that you can do morally that can help address the root problem and have you conceive a child. Just like, let's just slap IVF on it. This is your Band-Aid solution.
But also, in working within the medical community around the world, and here specifically among Catholic community, this is sometimes the first time they hear these kinds of conversations, because it's not going to be discussed in med school. They're not going to necessarily discuss, Catholic moral ethics. So all of a sudden they're thrown into a conversation at a Congress that they're attending with us. That's what happened in India, where we had nearly 1,000 medical students and nurses and doctors attending one of our Congresses, and it was an eye-opener. And almost all the presenters were local, like Dr. Finto, and it was working with us in this great cause, and many religious sisters who are doctors working as gynecologists got up and gave all these presentations, and the eyes of the people were just, we've never heard this. No one's talked to us about this. So it's important that for HLI, which is a Catholic educational missionary apostolate, is to see that it's a lot of times it's a lack of formation, even from couples who are not intending to do anything immoral, but they're struggling with the cross of infertility. And you want to rely on your doctor for guidance, and no one's ever come in between them and said, wait a minute, not a parent, not a grandparent, not their parish priest, or maybe they've never mentioned it.
Well, you want to be able to trust the people who know the science, who are in these positions. You want to be able to trust your doctor to tell you what you can do.
Right.
And unfortunately, because of the culture of death, that's not always possible. Correct.
And it's a narrative that governs the conversation today. But what I think what John Paul and Benedict and Pope Francis have been saying is not calling out, calling to the medical community, which we've talked about in here before as a vocation.
Yes.
Because it serves life, is to employ its skills, to employ its research, to employ all of its ability to serve life. And to do it in a moral way. We need to keep preaching that.
Okay, so I'm very proud of this episode. I'm going to tie it right back full circle. Can you tell our listeners about the bioethical program that we have going on all around the world that we did with the National Catholic Bioethics Center? Because that totally ties in of training people in all these different countries to be able to speak about these issues so that when they go and they do trainings, they can speak about them to an audience who's never heard it. So bring it right back to the mission.
Sure. So for our audience that may be unfamiliar with the National Catholic Bioethics Center, NCBC, you've probably seen it written in many of my columns. So I was very fortunate. One of our former servers of our mission, Dr. Joseph Meany, is now serving as president for the National Catholic Bioethics Center.
He's been on the podcast.
So wonderful friend, personal friend, but a great friend of HLI, and really started his mission work in HLI with HLI, and for nearly 22 years. So very dedicated. And so the reason why I bring this up is that it's because of him that I myself went through the certification in medical ethics, and then pursued the Masters of Science in Bioethics, so that, again, to sharpen my own tools and my own ability. So in our conversation, the NCBC has been using its certification in medical ethics for a number of decades. Beautiful, wonderful educational program that's for medical students. I mean, let's put it this way. It's for anyone interested in understanding the church's teaching in medical and bioethics, life and family.
which is like science plus ethics together.
Exactly. And so it uses as a foundation the Ethical and Religious Directives of Catholic Healthcare, which is published by the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops. And it's 77 principles in bioethics that we follow and adhere to in the service of life. So what we did is, by partnering with the NCBC, we wanted to bring this certification to the global community. The biggest challenge really was being global community, because I was fortunate, as the certification is in the United States, and for those that in other countries that have online ability, internet service reliability, and so forth, you were able to do much of this on the online side. But there were many in-person requirements that needed to be fulfilled. That's very hard for people in Africa, Latin America, other parts of the world. So we were looking for a way to overcome that hurdle. And because the personal connection is important, because that's when you do a lot of the discussions and you get people to talk it out, and you want that still to remain. So we were able to work out recently a global certification program, and we're piloting that program starting Monday. And so it's going to be right now we have 11 countries that are going to be participating. It's going to be 11, it's 11 countries actually. So it's 11 participants, but from each different countries, and they're going to do the pilot for.
They're all around the world. We have some in Africa, some in the Caribbean, some in Asia.
Exactly, and so they're coming from all the major continents. And what's going to be great is it's 10 months to 11 months by the time they complete everything. And the goal is why? Well, the goal here is to bring the church's perennial teaching to bear. And many of the people involved are already engaged. They already are involved in our pro-life and family movement. Some of them are doctors. Some of them are nurses. Some of them already have degrees in theology. We have 2 priests already involved. One has a doctorate in sacred theology. But again, just as myself, having those degrees, it's bringing those to the forefront, making a person look at those issues, and now how do they apply? So it's a great way to stretch the person to really look at the principles. How do you apply the principles? What do they mean? But it's going to talk about, for example, the more current issue of transgenderism, so gender identity confusion. So that's a current moral issue. We're going to deal with that in this program. So that's not necessarily right now happening in parts of the world, but it's coming. So we want to prepare them for this. It's going to deal with all of the issues affecting conjugal love and marriage, which we've been talking about. It's going to go into the issue of surrogacy, IVF. It's going to deal with all of the reproductive technologies, artificial insemination. It's going to deal with all of these issues. And what it's going to do is help the person to become a sharper tool. So I'm very, very excited. I hope people can hear it in my voice and maybe see it in my face, because this is what we want. Is to bring more people into this conversation.
And what's also great is that then, for instance, our affiliate in Nigeria is in the middle of training all these nurses right now. That's because the UN is coming in and training nurses to promote abortion and contraception in rural towns. Like the UN has a program where they're training 4,000 nurses to go to rural towns in Nigeria and urge women to get abortions and use contraception.
Right.
So to counter that, our affiliate in Nigeria is training nurses and telling them the truth about God's plan for marriage and human life. Right. And these are all the problems with birth control. And these are like moral, but also physical. These are the side effects. These are the dangers of abortion. Abortion kills a child. And so, for instance, that affiliate is going to be going through this program, and he'll be able to use all of the knowledge that he's learning in going in and training these nurses. Right. So it'll have such widespread effects.
But also what it'll do is, with all of that, is also introduces them to other sources, so that it helps them to know where they can find those resources. How do they engage those resources? For example, in the article of my column on surrogacy, in some of our website information on surrogacy, IVF, and so forth, we're going to quote a document of the church called Donum Vitae on the gift of human life. And so you look at this and the beauty of life. What is that document? Most people have never seen that document. There's many others like that. So it's good for people to know what the church teaches, where they can find those resources. The other thing that's important within the medical community is to know where there are limitations. There are many things that we might be able to, like, for example, should we be employing in vitro fertilization? That's a question that ought to be asked. Because I can do something, does it mean I should do it? Is there?
I was going to say that's already been answered, but
of course it has. But for many in the medical community, no one's ever spoken to them about it. So they consider IVF a medical technique that serves life, that serves people's need, end quote, need. And so but how do we respond to that?
Mm-hmm.
Why is the church opposed to IVF? Why is the church opposed to surrogacy? Why is the church opposed to reproductive technologies that supplement, that replace the conjugal act? Why? Why is this important? I mean, again, having priests, who don't know this either for some reason, will say to a couple, but we want children. So yeah, there's no problem with in vitro fertilization, only to come to realize after being informed, oh my goodness, I did not know that. And why? And sometimes I get letters from people, well, how can a priest not know that? Well, as I mentioned earlier in our podcast, Colleen, each country, each part of the world, the seminaries are doing yeoman's work. But a lot of times these particular subjects, specific subjects, are not necessarily within that community.
Because they haven't touched the country
The
yet.
overarching teaching in morality is there, but not necessarily brought into a practical situation because it's not something they're dealing with.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, they're dealt a hand of cards, and they've never talked about it, never saw it, but they see the end result, and until someone points it out. So that's what makes our educational apostolate and then global certification. And the goal with that global certification is the following year is to expand it out further. And keep growing it, and to be able to offer it to Episcopal conferences, and to be able to offer to the bishops, here is something that can help your priest, but not just priest, your religious, your lay catechist. It can be offered to your doctors, your nurses, your medical community, anyone serving life. So it's not a restrictive program. It's meant to enhance what we already are doing, to make it stronger, and to really give it the credentials it needs, within the certification coming through the National Catholic Bioethics Center, which has already earned, its position in this conversation. And I would say with this is we have bishops now wanting to open bioethical centers in their dioceses. So this partnership with NCBC and HLI is a great, great opportunity. And I'm looking forward to it because I'm traveling soon to join NCBC in a workshop for bishops. And I'll be participating in one of the presenters. And while we're there, we're going to actually be talking about how can we strengthen these opportunities in the missionary community. So I'm very excited.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad to hear you talk about it because I've known a little bit of the details of it, but just kind of hearing you flesh out what the plan is going forward is so good for me to be able to be aware of, and also for our audience. So
awesome.
Yeah, definitely. If you want to support us in that, I'll put a link in the description.
Please do.
Yeah. Thank you, Father. This has been a great episode. It's so good to have you back on the podcast.
Well, thank you very much.
I always love having you as a guest.
Look forward to the next opportunity.
Yes, it was so good to have you here. And to all of our listeners, please like, subscribe, check out the new ebooks we have coming out, and keep on living the culture of life. God bless.